is one of the most celebrated economists, somebody I've had the pleasure of interacting on many occasions. The former chief economic advisor is back with what many people call a blockbuster. Off Council, an interesting name to the book, and in conversation with me right here is Professor Arvind Subramanian. Thank you very much for being with us. Off Council, an interesting picture. This really, for me, kind of encapsulates your time at North Block a little, about for 4 years. Explain me the title. Is it a legal parlance?
Actually, it's a title suggested by this very bright Indian political theorist who's a fellow at Harvard. His name is Madhav Khosla, and so he suggested this title, and I think what it connotes is, I think I'm told that in legal firms you have this person who's not quite a partner and yet kind of has a very important role. So this kind of insider, outsider kind of sense is what he said, and I thought that was a good way of capturing. And of course, my boss was a lawyer as well. So
and I think you were perhaps one of India's most celebrated global insiders, so to say. The subtext of that book says the challenges of the Modi-Jaitley economy, and there has been so much written and said about who really runs the economy, who is the economic manager. Have you added fuel to fire? I mean, whose economy this really is? Is this an economy being run by the Prime Minister? Is this being run by North Block? There are too many conjectures. Let's have somebody who's been there clear the air for us.
By saying Modi-Jaitley, I've covered all bases, actually. So, no, I mean, in any system, decision-making is complex and so many actors. And I think that, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are absolutely the key interlocutors on this. So it just captures that sense.
So let me begin with the substantive parts of the book. There will be portions where I'm going to quote the book, and there will be portions where I'll quote the controversy around it. And I think the big headline that everybody seems to be talking about right now, let's just date back to 2016, and this is demonetization, and the term draconian. The exercise was draconian, and I know you go on to then say the resilience of the people was tested and all of that. In hindsight, this was an exercise which had shifting goalposts. In hindsight, a lot of money came back to the system, so people believe, was this an exercise in futility? Why do you choose to call it draconian, and why did you not criticize it while you were in office?
So I think that, the term we used in the survey to this was large structural shock. That's kind of how economists speak, right? So withdrawing 86% of cash, you can call it severe, you can call it extreme, you can call it draconian, you can call it a large structural shock. You pick your term. It's all the same. It's basically the same, right? But in the book, my aim was very clear, right? All this raging controversy, good, bad, right, wrong, cost, benefits, etc., right? That has going on. It's going to play out politically. Every side is going to play out. Having left government, I wanted to, what I thought were two genuinely new and important questions about demonetization, which I call the two puzzles, as you know.
Yes.
One puzzle is, of course, a lot of hardship was imposed on the informal cash sector, and yet politically it was, at that stage at least, very successful in the UP election. And for me, understanding the political economy of reform is very important. And also it's part of a broader worldwide phenomenon. I mean, in the US, they say, why do people vote against their self-interest? Why do white middle-aged men who require Social Security, who require Medicare, vote for President Trump, who's taking away all these things? Similarly, the question here was, if it inflicted so much costs on people, why did they vote for that?
Have you been able to arrive at an answer?
So there, I do give an answer on this.
Let me just say it for the record. What is the answer?
I think the answer, or the hypothesis is, and something that I would love people to challenge me on, criticize me. But I think that to some extent, it was almost intrinsic to the political success that the costs were imposed across a broad swathe of people, right? My argument is that because the costs were so large and spread over, it was a signaling device that it was seen as significant. Also, it shows that you didn't leave out anyone, so there was no question of, saying, oh, were some favored or not favored. And for me, the political economy lesson from this is, is it easier actually to impose difficult policy actions, right, when many people are affected as opposed to only a few vested interests are affected? Because it has a lot of bearing.
It's easy to justify, perhaps.
That's one possibility, for example, easier to justify, because there's no, if you leave out some, then people say, why
That's
you...
discretion.
Yeah, whatever discussion.
Yeah.
First, now coming to the controversial, the second one, right? See, I think that, and in the book, I don't know whether you read that in the introduction, I say that, Paul Krugman was here in late 2016, and I had
over a breakfast conversation.
We were discussing, because he's a guru on how to model these things, he's done this, so we're discussing this. And I think if you asked any macroeconomist, that you take away 86%, draconian, severe, whatever you want to call it, right? You would expect a large GDP response. So my second puzzle, which is what I want people to focus on, I mean, remember, both of these are new and important points. Why is it that if you take away 86%, actually the impact on GDP...
don't see a crash.
Yeah, it's fairly muted. That disconnect between draconian action and a response, which was the puzzle, is what I want to focus people on. Now, why is it important to answer this question? One, it could be, are we just measuring the wrong thing, for example? Is, GDP doesn't have the informal sector, maybe the agriculture impacts not come through. Or is it that we have a genuinely resilient economy, right? That, there's something special about India where this, or is it the case that we just don't understand how cash works in the economy? So I think it's terribly important to understand these things. So instead of focusing on words, I think we should try and understand what is going on in the Indian economy.
So Professor Subramanian, I think you're absolutely right in saying that the economy was resilient and we did not see a crash of 4 percentage point in the GDP, at best about 1.5 percentage point. But I think the reality is that there was an economic cost to demonetization. Anecdotally speaking, there certainly was. You look at the MSMEs, they haven't still recovered. The small scale industry, big at the receiving end of this entire thing. In hindsight, was the economic cost justified in the name of passing on a signal? And the reason why I'm asking you this question is not because I support or I trash demonetization. A lot of celebrated columnists and economists have said something which is very pertinent, that if we were a more evolved economic society, we would have had riots on the streets of India over money being taken away the way it was. Why do you believe that didn't happen?
But that's what speaks to my first puzzle, you see, that in fact is actually, it's not just that riots didn't happen, but people actually voted for, in the UP election. So, some said, oh, this is a post-truth phenomenon or whatever, but it's, you can't...
Was it a signal against the rich and that made... large chunks vote for the government?
In fact, what I say in this is that, but if you only wanted to go after the rich, right, there are many ways you can only go after the rich. But the interesting question is, why did you have to impact the poor in order to take away from the rich? That is the puzzle of demonetization. And that's why I think it's fascinating, fascinating not just intellectually, but in terms of just trying to understand the economy. So I think that's why I posed it the way I did.
You've made a lot of statements in the book which obviously point to the fact that you were not a part of the decision-making process on demonetization.
That's your remark, it's not mine.
Because you say that, I heard the speech in my North Block room on public account that's available and all of that. If you were in the decision-making process of demonetization, with the benefit of hindsight today and what happened that followed, would you impose demonetization on India?
Those are luxuries that you never have in real time. Put yourself, have hindsight. These are all hypotheticals, what ifs.
When it happened, did you disagree with demonetization?
I think that, for one thing, we all learned about demonetization. I say that in the book as we went along. And, all the costs and benefits started becoming apparent over a period of time. So I think, it's just one of those things that plays out in real time, which you have to, understand and learn and move on.
Because this is your statement has become a political issue of sorts. You've got the Congress president who's on record said that, if he disagreed, why did you not quit? I just think everybody got carried away with that one headline.
Exactly.
Nobody really read the subtext of how
Exactly.
you were, in some sense, also justifying what happened.
No,
in all of that.
in fact, I think it's very funny. People picked on the word draconian, and in fact, I don't know whether
Do you also have the luxury to call it draconian and not structural changes like you had to as an
I think maybe
economist?
that's the little bit of leeway you get after leaving, But large structural shock is basically an economist's way of saying it's whatever draconian, right?
Yes,
It does.
yes.
So I think that if anything, in that whole puzzle, I was saying action extreme, response limited. We must understand that. So that's what I think we should, and I think we should really focus on the substance and move
Fair
on.
point.
Yeah.
So let's leave demonetization behind. You are in India at a time, and your book is aptly coming at a time when there seems to be this tug of war between RBI and the government, and you seem to be unintentionally adding some fire to this, because I'm going to quote some sentences out of the book, and it says that RBI has such ultra-conservative, almost paranoia. You refer to these words. But isn't it this paranoia that people believe has held us in good stead? The fact that RBI is paranoid as a financial institution, because this government and successive governments, there will be this temptation for populism, for political bravado. You need an institution that's conservative at times like these. We live in very uncertain economic times.
Yeah, a good question. I think that, RBI, give it a lot of credit. It's one of India's rightly most legitimate, most credible institutions, and we have a collective self-interest. Forget about what others think of us or not, to preserve that, right? One. Two, by definition, they are a conservative institution, and they must remain conservative institutions, right? Now, I take it now we're speaking about the excess reserves issue, and we'll speak.
And I will speak on that. Yeah.
First, let's speak on that, because that's where I want to speak. Now, conservatism, absolutely, but our considered, or my considered technical evaluation is that it is beyond conservative, right? That's a technical assessment. I raised it, as you know, 2-3 years ago when Raghu was here.
Yes.
And by the way, tomorrow there's an article coming out in EPW where we spell out the whole technical thing in full detail. And so I have, of course, people must challenge this, but I think technically there's no doubt in my mind. That's point. But the two other points I would make are this, which are very important. That a technical assessment of excess reserves does not translate into an automatic right that be passed on, especially that it be passed on for financing the deficit or expenditure. Even when I first raised it, and now I say in the book very clearly, it should only be used for recapitalizing, and only if the government lives up to its part of making making the recapitalization work. If this money were used for anything else like financing, I would be totally against it. I think.
So what you're essentially saying is that, technically speaking, there is a need to review the position on how that should be used. A healthy technical debate needs to be around that.
But there's another point which is, in a sense, a little bit of my wistfulness about something that should have happened in the past, right? I think that central banks, as we began with, very conservative, absolutely. But I think if you look at the history of the crisis, global financial crisis, you look at Mario Draghi or Ben Bernanke, I think they added to their credibility by being bold and coming to the support of the economy.
Right.
So in this case, my view always was that maybe the RBI, certainly in the early stages when lack of money was an issue, could have been more bold and imaginative and said, look, we can use our balance sheet.
Some part of the bill.
Exactly.
For recaps.
But as I say, insist, one, it must be done cooperatively. There's no question of
that's the point I want to ask, and I will come to the Draghi movement that you speak about in the book as well. There is also in your book, even though you criticize the RBI for perhaps being a tad too paranoid, you also say that transfer should be voluntarily done. It should not be imposed. But if they don't do it voluntarily, then, and if the government of the day issues a diktat for that money to be transferred, which is exactly what Section 7 and all of that controversy is about, How are you going to read into that situation?
I would not be in favor of, unilaterally government, taking that money from the RBI, especially not for financing the deficit or anything like that.
But do you believe that's where the paranoia is coming from? It's an election year. People fear there could be fiscal deficit concerns. People feel, in the last year of its term, most governments want to be populist. Is that what the fear is? Because any amount of transfer is going to be inflation stoking.
Yeah, but I think the government has, again, I don't know the details because I'm out of it, but I think the government has said it only wants to review the framework and it's not asking for money.
Which is why the committee.
Yeah, exactly, all of that, right? But I just want to end this by a very important distinction and a nuance, right? On the one hand, we should rightly tell the government, please, be responsible and not adversarial in this use of this. But equally, the question I raise in the book is that why don't we also expect the RBI to have done this, voluntarily early on, in order to do this? Why has it come to a situation where,
it almost seems as if, and terms like raiding of reserves.
Yeah, exactly. So I think so. Therefore, I think that only if it's used for some purpose, only if it's done cooperatively and voluntarily. And if not, I think I would...
Fair point, and that's a very sane argument to make, and nobody would dispute that. But I will take one more question on the reserves, because your good friend Raghuram Rajan was in conversation with us, and there's a point that he made that kind of stuck with me, and all through when I was reading that book, I thought I'd ask you that question. And he said, let there be no two ways about it. This is government's money. This is government's assets sitting with the RBI, it's government's equity and all of that. He said, but at times when we need that reserve, RBI is a better entity to be sitting on those reserves because it's a AAA rated organization. It can hold its own, which the government is not. Do you agree with that part of the argument?
See, I think Raghu was making more the argument. See, firstly, there's no such thing as central banks are not triple rated or whatever. Right? This is all, I don't.
Former governors say that.
Yeah, these are all, the guardians of virtue will always say that. So let's give it to them. But I think that this is one of what I feel a little bit sad about. That if RBI were to ever need that money, I think the government will and should be willing to provide the money because it's in the common interest. What we're saying now is you need a cushion, but is there money beyond that cushion? And if that is, then why not use it in the best possible way? So that's I think is the only argument here, and I think it's something that can easily...
I think you actually encapsulate the whole thing in a beautiful line in your book, and you say that regulation and strong balance sheets and put on the front line in service economy, these assets far from getting depleted actually get replenished. But you're essentially talking about bank recapitalization and that bill being put
because
by the
remember,
RBI.
I say that for two reasons, right? One, this excess reserves is a balance sheet, it's a capital
Exactly, yes.
so it should be used only for capital. Capital. So I think that's I think very important to maintain. Second, this is the biggest challenge of our time, the twin balance sheet challenge. So using it for the twin balance sheet, I think would be the biggest return for money. But with the absolute, this is not a second thought or a second order qualifier, only under conditions that, it be done voluntarily, it be used, and that the government lives up to its side of the bargain in terms of things. Otherwise, all the kind of misgivings and anxieties, I would have sympathy with.
You have written in detail about the banking space, and I want to go to the other prompt corrective action bit that you speak about again very nicely in your book. But one big picture question, because we are talking in times when it almost seems that there are two ends of the financial spectrum, the government on one side and the RBI on the other. I think the truth is somewhere in between. I think we in media like to also play it up like that. It always makes for a better story. But the truth is that RBI is an institution, and of course it's an elected government of the day. Why do you believe matters came to an extent where there seems to be a complete breakdown of dialogue? There seems to be this sort of invoking Section 7. There seems to be this, this mistrust of sorts. Who muddied the waters?
That's a great question.
To which you will give me an answer.
To which I wish I could give you an answer. But I think it's an answer that's going to be as much in the realm of politics and psychology and individuals as it is about economics. So I think that, and I say in the book, comparative advantage means that economists should talk about economics, not about all. It's a very, I think it's a very fair question why it has come to that. I think both sides need to do some soul searching on why this has happened. But it's a very good question. No, absolutely.
Do you believe there's too much of free speech happening at the RBI and too many tweets coming out of North Block?
I mean, you're asking that of someone who himself was accused of being,
yes,
too vocal a critic of the RBI. So
no, there's the reason.
See, but one, I want to say one last point. Right? I think the RBI and government will never always see eye to eye, and that is as it should be. There must be some creative tension, but I think what is not, I think, negotiable, or what should not be, I think, undermined, is that basic sense that this is an institution that will be allowed broadly to, have a freedom of action and not be overtly politicized in any way. I mean, that's why that's one. But that being said, we have to say that independence, autonomy, etc., do not, in fact, must not rule out, openness, consultation, cooperation. I think that, so when I felt free to criticize the RBI, when I was here on their inflation forecast projections or their, excess capital when I raised it with the group. But I think I felt I had the freedom to do that because the basic fundamentals of the trust and everything were there. So when you have that mutual trust and things, I think you can afford to.
No,
but I think we should try and maintain. This is a great institution, one of India's best. We must safeguard its, whatever its independence is kind of a, people misinterpret it, but
operational autonomy.
Yeah, autonomy, freedom to take decisions, whatever, and they are there for a good reason.
No, I think you're absolutely right when you say creative tension is important, and I think you speak to. So it depends on who you speak to. If you speak to the government and they believe creative tension is important, but it's the elected government of the day. If you speak to former central bankers, they say one needs to step off and back off, and that back offing has to be done by the government. So I think it's an argument that's got somewhere there. But as somebody who's been a part of decision making here, who was at North Block, and now you have the advantage of being a global insider of sorts. How do you read a headline that says that questions, is the RBI governor going to step down? Is he going to quit? Is he he is perhaps going to quit? I mean, these kind of headlines, some of it I think was unnecessary, but even then, I mean, from a central banker point of view.
In this,
or read a deputy governor's speech that says a tension between the two is going to earn the wrath of markets.
See, I think that perceptions, international perceptions, etc., matter, but finally we need to have a good working relationship for our own sake. If we have good institutions, the country benefits. If we have consultation, the country benefits. So I think that's what I think is important, and I think let's also be clear and honest that one reason we have the RBI also is as a kind of bulwark against political cycles, right? I mean, we know where we are on the calendar.
Oh yes, absolutely.
So we don't want imprudent kind of lending and decision making, lending, whatever to happen at this stage. So I think we need that. Both sides need to be aware of that.
I'll take one question that you briefly kind of refer to in the book and then go back to substantive parts of the book. But this is an important point because I think one of the issues where the government and the RBI have a huge difference is liquidity, and the government believes that there isn't enough liquidity, at least for the NBFC part of the economy. The RBI believes it's the system-wide liquidity that they're going to look at. How does one look at that position going forward? Because any amount of exuberance lending could land us in a situation like we were in 2008. But the way an elected government looks at it is if you're not going to have enough liquidity, there will be a growth impact, there'll be impact on jobs, consumption is going to be hit. How does one kind of maneuver through a puzzle like that?
Yeah, that's again a very good question. I think that see, firstly, as you rightly said, the other day I read someone saying that you have to grow yourself lend yourself out of the PCA problem, right? But I just want to add one thing to what you said, that if it was kind of over exuberant and bad lending, imprudent lending that led to this problem in the first place, by
You
just
don't want to go back to it.
there, especially, and this is what I want to add, especially if the underlying governance mechanisms and incentive mechanisms have not changed. That's where the reform, remember my 4 R's, yeah?
Yes.
Reform. So if that hasn't changed, just opening the spigots is not going to. Now, coming to your, and it speaks to the question of, is good economics good politics or not, right? When I was in government, I always, told the finance minister always that, I think this kind of, bad economics or populist economics is not ultimately good politics either. It's not obvious that you open the spigots a little bit before the election, therefore
Somebody's going to clean up behind you.
Yeah, no, not only that, it's not even clear that it might work. I mean, I have examples in the last 4 years where some actions that were done in advance of elections didn't work. So as an advisor, I would say that therefore the two can be reconciled by saying that, if you do the right thing fundamentally, I think growth will happen, jobs will be delivered, and so on. So, but it's not an easy argument to make. I don't think we should, get persuaded by arguments we make. There will always be this compulsion. But I think that at this stage, opening spigots in order to satisfy something, because remember that now the NBFC problem has become a new problem that we have, right?
That's a question I'm going to take up with you. In one chapter, you write that we still have not identified all the stress closely and especially amongst the non-banking financial companies, which will feed back into the banking system, and we should plan for matters to worsen as they currently are. Are you red flagging more NPA in the making? Are you worried about what the NBFCs could throw up eventually which is going to feed into the banking system?
So here's this evening I'm going to give a talk, and my new idea for the day today is is that I think that like Raghu did an AQR for the banks, I think we need to do an AQR for the NBFCs.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is
administered by the RBI.
Now I think it has to be done. Remember, it has to be done a bit cooperatively because the biggest NBFCs are in housing. RBI doesn't regulate them, so so there's all these cooperation issues. But I do think that
some assessment is required.
Yeah, because I think what the AQR did was first. You come clean.
It told you at least the magnitude of the problem.
Exactly, and the magnitude mobilized political action.
That's right.
Right? Similarly, I think, now in the short run you say, oh my God, it'll spook markets, etc., etc. But if there's something spook-worthy, I think it's better that it comes out rather than festers. And final point I will make is that, we are almost 8 to 9 years into this twin balance sheet challenge, right? I mean, if at this stage, we are still kind of finding new problems, then our financial system, I think, really needs, it's not going to deliver for the economy. So for all these reasons, I do think that, the NBFC, I think we need to get to the bottom of this, maybe have an AQR. I think in the short run, there may be some disgruntlement, but I think we should deal with it.
But in the larger economic framework, if there is one fault line that worries you right now about India, is that the NBFC space in the financial sector, really?
No, I don't think we can say that. I still think the banking space is
worrisome.
Is worrisome, right? Banking, NBFCs, both together. We can't say which is more. I think both worrisome. I think it is, and we should be cleaning up in order to pave the way for future growth. And
Fair point. You have said that regulation and strong balance sheets. You've said on PCA, you have written that RBI deserves credit for maintaining the integrity of the PCA process amidst pressure from the government to dilute it. We now have this whole debate, and there is a committee within the RBI technical committee looking into this. Can RBI afford to look away? Can RBI afford to relent on the prompt corrective action? There is a reason why these banks were put there. I know they are flush with deposits now, and which is why this whole clamor that they should be made to learn. Can they go back on it? Because
I don't know, but I think that to maintain.
Should they go back on it?
I think, remember, when we speak about reforms of the banking system, right? I've always said for some banks we have to have more privatization, the bank nationalization.
That's right, yes.
But for the weaker banks that are, fundamentally weak, consolidation is not a solution. So how do we, exit from weak banks? And the prompt corrective action framework, it's kind of Mr. Y.V. Reddy's answer, right? You over time shrink the balance sheet. And I think that, some amount of that has to be maintained. I think that is the way forward.
In fact, I think you've described the whole bank merger thing very well, and you say consolidation at best is band-aid for the system, and at worst a distraction for management from their key priority, which is to deal with bad assets. You still have consolidation happen in the banking space. There was this big consolidation with the State Bank of India and its subsidiaries. Now, of course, Dena Bank and Bank of and things like that. Are we too scared to let banks fail in this country?
I think
Can we afford to?
I think we're too scared to let many things fail in this country.
Including banking.
Banking is one of them, and there are other examples. This is what I call the Chakravyuha challenge, the exit problem.
Yes.
I mean, we shouldn't be light about this because it's difficult to address it. It's not politically not an easy thing to do. But I think, can we afford it? I mean, the longer you postpone the problem, the more more it mounts and the more difficult it becomes over time to address it. So I think that no, we cannot afford now to procrastinate any further on many of these problems.
Fair point. There are parts in the book, and you have, in some sense, put it back into the economic debate, and in some sense, you've said that you've now become more acceptable of it. You were floating the idea of a bad bank when the crisis was unfolding. That idea didn't find many takers. I'm presuming because IBC gives a legislative, legal ring fencing. The ring fencing that's required for a decision making like that. But if you see how IBC has unfolded, and there are no two ways about it, it's a big reform, it's a big exit thing. India did not have one. But if you see how it's unfolding, it's also mired by legal disputes. People have moved courts. The haircuts are pretty steep in many cases. Some assets are finding good and robust buyers. In hindsight, would bank have been a swifter solution to all of this?
I think yes and no. I think we could have started it earlier, but my sense is that it kind of relates to the line which I don't know whether you're going to let me say it if you're not going to say it. I have a line which I thought more people should be think about is I say the king is dead, long live the justices.
That's right. Yes.
I think for whatever reason for the last 20-25 years, stigmatized capitalism and so on, it seems to be the case that one of the few locations of legitimacy in the system happens to be the Supreme Court, especially the Supreme Court, right? So willy-nilly everything ends up in the judicial system. So looking back, I think that the bad bank, maybe it would have floundered on the same thing, that the delays, because as you said, the IBC, the deadlines have slipped in many cases, and even out of the first 12, 3, 4.
Just 3, 4,
yeah.
Yes.
And so, but there's no doubt that you have to go through that. I mean, it has to go through the Supreme Court. Verdicts come, they get accepted, and we move on. So I think that I think is unavoidable in the Indian system.
Fair point.
It's the price for stigmatized capitalism.
So going back to Indradhanush, I know it was thought of at that banking conclave and all of that, but was it worth wasting our time over? It was going to be inadequate to begin with.
Yeah, I think with Indradhanush, I will say that not just with hindsight, and I say that in the book, even in real time, it was clearly inadequate to the challenge, and I say why. What were the kind of collective kind of whatever? I don't want to say mistakes, but the collective shortcomings, both government and RBI. I think had. I don't know whether I have this chart in the introduction where I contrast Ashish Gupta's estimates with the RBI's extreme stress estimate. It's like
chalk and cheese.
Yeah, it's like chalk and cheese. You see,
daylight.
And if that was what the system was thinking was the problem, no wonder you got into the notion. They said, it's a small problem, throw some money and you'll solve it. So I think there are some lessons to be learned from that experience. And that's why later on when the AQR happened, you could see clearly that, just do the thought experiment. Had we had the AQR result in, say, 2014 or 2015, I mean, there's no way.
The action would have begun a lot earlier.
Yeah, no way.
So,
Indonesia
you know,
should have
just on
happened.
that point, because I was in any case going to ask you on the Draghi moment particularly, I like the way you say the Draghi moment should have not been missed, and that would have changed the entire dynamic around the twin balance sheet problem. There are people out there who believe that RBI under the stewardship of Raghuram Rajan did impact growth. He kind of choked credit by bringing in this AQR. You are somebody who believes it should have actually been done earlier than it was. Do you believe, even though the AQR was happening, the RBI, when you say the Draghi moment, did not do whatever it takes to fix the problem?
See, I think let's be fair. I think that, as I say in the book, I think it's totally you know, off base to say, you know, AQR stopped credit, etc., because I think AQR did meaningfully push the reform process forward. My problem is that it didn't happen earlier. Now, if you think that you know, all that matters is credit, regardless of quality or ability to, you know, take these risks, then, you know, yes, you will say that's not right to do. But we know that in these situations, the earlier you act, the lower the cost and the quicker things come back. You know, we're still in this for so many years. So I don't at all buy the argument that the earlier would have been worse. I mean, because I don't buy the argument that AQR was at all negative. I think AQR was actually a very positive step forward for all the reasons that we discussed.
Fair point, yes.
And, you know, had it been done earlier, we may have got, you know, quicker action, quicker resolution, and so on.
I think in my last interview with you, and just when you were demitting office as the chief economic advisor, you used stigmatized capitalism, something that you just referred to a while back. When you look at names that come out in India's banking space, Nirav Modi, Vijay Mallya, Ravi Parthasarthi, Mehul Choksi, Rana Kapoor, does some of that stigma, I mean, I know it's a suit boot ki sarkar jibe that kind of started it all, and you've not shied away from mentioning it with Mr. Gandhi's name, but is it somewhere an acceptance of the fact that there is truth to the stigma? Look at the kind of bad apples that we have in our system, and they just about continued to
No, I think absolutely no question. But I think the thing is that this stigmatized capitalism goes back. You know, and remember that if you trace the origins, I think what the irony is that now, of course, with all these names, it gets validated, right? These people do these things, maybe they get away, whatever, right? So it reinforces stigmatized, they get bailed out, and that's a real problem. But I think if you look back in our history, you know, even our successful capitalists may have, you know,
were not so.
Yeah, exactly. They grew because
non-stigmatized.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that, and I think there was a brief moment, you know, when the IT sector took off, when we felt that this was, you know, capital that, you know, did not prosper and thrive because of its proximity to government. But apart from that, it's you know, it's not easy to find you know, unstigmatized capitalism in India. And, you know, look, it's something that we just have to live with. We have to try and get out of it. And so that's why, you know, I don't want to be too harsh in blaming any one actor in the present, either government or RBI.
Fair point, yes.
Because it's a cumulative thing, right?
And it's happened over successive governments.
Exactly.
You can't blame this government alone. I mean, for all you know, they've actually inherited this.
Yeah.
But a quick last question on RBI, and then I want to quickly shift to growth very quickly. One of the questions on RBI, and I think I can't not ask you this question, there is a board meeting right around the corner, and there are many people who believe that RBI should be a more board-governed institution. Now, this isn't true of central banks around the world. What do you make of attempts like that? Because all along one thought that RBI is a body of experts, it's a specialized sort of a job. The board needs to be there for broader supervision, but can't be a part of the decision-making process. What do you make of this attempt to make RBI a more board-governed institution?
See, I'm genuinely not an expert on
but with
on
data
this.
and facts that are available in the public space.
Yeah, public space. I think that, you know, any overt politicization of the board, I think it will not be good in the long run for us. And so I think that we should try and to the greatest extent possible, allow the autonomy and decision-making space, you know, keep the board as a, you know, kind of an eminence grise kind of body. But I guess, you know, all these things work if the underlying relationship is in reasonably good shape, right? And so we need to address that, why the underlying relationship may or may not be good, and what we need to, address that. And yes, but I would be against any overt, politicization and anything that smacks of,
A control.
control over, see, and it's very difficult to define, this is too much, too little, and whatever. But I think we can kind of smell it or sense it when things kind of cross lines. And I think that, and everyone is aware of that. No one needs to be told, So I think we should all, good, serious people, learn
Not
to
fall for the temptation.
Yeah,
of any
learn to respect those lines, I think.
I want to speak to you about growth, because that seems to be a huge debate in India. And on a lighter note, a lot of people believe that people in Europe and other parts of the world want to discuss the future. We are so busy discussing the past and fighting over it that sometimes one misses the point, that how much is our growth potential, how much are we growing at. But just to put things in perspective, I know you and many other economic experts have not questioned, but have not been very happy with the data flow in India. Data is not very, I'm not saying you've ever questioned the credibility of the data, but data is something that people are worried about as far as macroeconomy is concerned. This is for the first time when the credibility of our macro data is under question. Perhaps it has been spurred by the involvement of a politically appointed body like NITI Aayog in this. Now there are fresh reports that NITI Aayog actually denied a study and higher figures that were showing the previous government in a better light, higher numbers. How do you read all of this? Because the credibility of macro data or statistical institutes is important, because this is the evidence on which policy is made.
Correct.
And this kind of really muddies our future and our past.
No, that's a very good point. I think that the way I see it is this. Look, I don't know all the insides of what's going on now. I've been out of government, whatever. Certainly, if as an economist you presented, the data for that period and this period, it would demand an explanation why all the other indicators were so different and yet growth was so similar. It would kind of naturally raise questions, and which will, but the statisticians have their own answer, which I don't know enough about, I can't comment on. But as you said, I want to say just one or two things. As you said, this is not just about the credibility of the data, but about the data generating process and institutions that generate it, right? It's point number one. So it's in our interest that, we don't want, every time a number comes out, people say,
question the number.
Yeah, question the number. It's not, it's costly for us. And I think we should, internalize that. But the second thing I would say is that, this is a very technical exercise. You need experts, you need technical expertise, and it should be the job of experts to do this. I who spent my time on this GDP data, even I was, often couldn't understand all the ins and outs. So I think that we should, rely on experts, technical expertise to solve these problems, and not bring in other agencies or whatever to be the,
What is the fundamental error to involve a politically appointed agency like the NITI Aayog?
I think just use the experts, let
the statisticians do their job.
Yeah, let them do their job. It's a highly technical exercise. I mean, and if you want, get all kinds of expertise from all over the world, India, whatever. But get the technical experts, get them to give us the number, and don't involve anyone else. It's a technical task.
No, that's fairly put, and I think that's a very sane point. The reason why I asked that question, sir, is that we now seem to be doing very well. We've in fact grown at 7.35% in the first 4 years of this government, as against 6.7% in the last 5 of the previous government. Many people believe there's always a smell test for economic growth. And on the smell test, this growth number seems to fail. If you look at the earnings of the top 500 companies, if you look at investment numbers, you look at credit offtake, it doesn't seem to marry together with high growth, and which is why I think the questions are.
Yeah, that's what I that's what I meant by saying, as an economist, you have all these indicators like exports, capital flows, earnings, whatever, saying one thing, and the GDP numbers saying something different. I mean, again, as I said, the statisticians have their response. I think there's enough of a kind of puzzle here that requires, serious technical arbitration, as it were, right? And so, as I said, get the technical experts, get a lot of them, and let them sort it out.
Quick closing questions. US and China, and I think every time they engage or they disengage or they arrest people and not arrest people like it's happening, they seem to put the world on tenterhooks because there is this looming trade war. How is China going to react to what our US action is going to be? We can't ring ourselves, possibly can we, because our export is going to be determined on how global trade will be, which will be a function of where our current account will be. Is it going to be at 3% or is it going to be at 2.5%? Are really questions that are determined by factors of what US and China will do.
See, I think what is happening now in the global economy is, I think, very deeply worrying. I think that there are anxieties about, globalization, capitalism, societies are kind of unraveling. Sometimes I wonder whether, because we're so close to events, we can't see how, seismic they are. Even what's happening in France, for example.
Precisely,
right?
yeah.
So that's one. And then on top of this, we have the two world superpowers, squabbling like this, and all of us basically are helpless, right? I do think that this trade war is not over. I think it's going to be a much more protracted, prolonged thing, because it's about fundamentally a rising power saying, a status quo power saying, we cannot accept the rising power.
True.
For some good reasons, not all bad reasons, some good reasons, like the technologies transfer, whatever. So we're in for a long haul in terms of uncertainty and trade wars and all of that. And I think we just have to brace ourselves for that. And the only thing we can do is what we control ourselves, which is all the challenges we have to solve, including agriculture. By the way, I think agriculture is something that we need to focus much more on.
So as we wrap up, and before I go to tennis, which is where I know your heart lies, and you've dedicated a chapter to Federer and Nadal, and I'm going to ask why and how in just a bit. A lot of people believe that India has to make a choice between hard numbers and soft issues, and there are things in the larger social space that are worrying, whether it is a very heightened communal narrative, whether it's a very heightened suspicion on institutions being at war with the government. Are these issues that you believe are substantive issues and will be and could be challenges or risks that they pose to our economic development, economic growth?
See, I think the evidence around the world always has been that if there's conflict, internal conflict, weak institutions, all these things, I do think that it's going to be detrimental to long-run growth. I think that sound institutions, minimal social conflict, greater inclusiveness. I mean, this is the strength of the Indian model, right? That we've done all these things to keep our institutions sound, conflict minimal, so on. So, from a long-run point of view, you're absolutely right. It is something that's very important.
So, if I may take a last question, the last chapter in your book, you veer towards tennis, and you give the readers an insight onto who you're supporting. So, who's going to be a favorite player, and why that chapter? If you can explain. I'm not a big tennis buff, so. So you talk about tennis fandom in the Federer and Nadal era.
So this is I'm a big tennis fan, and our two sons also played tennis, and I'm just obsessed with tennis, and also the fact that we had two of the greatest players playing in our era, I think it's just extraordinary. So the one thing I would request all readers to do, if you don't mind, is in page 314.
That's a beautiful picture.
There's a picture,
and your description of it.
Yeah, but as I said, the description of it, and then Rahul Jacob, who writes also for the Financial Times.
Right.
And then I say at the end, if you look at the picture, for all the things I probably got wrong on economic policy,
you got this one
there
right.
is some consolation that I may have got this description right. So maybe comparative advantage dictates that I should do tennis and not economics.
So a last question. When you wrapped up your innings at North Block, you said you're going to go back and enjoy grandfatherhood. And the book is also dedicated to Bodhi, as you say, our focus,
our new anchor
and our future.
Yeah.
have you gotten used to sleepless nights and changing nappies, or are you just someone who likes to play with the baby and everything else is left to probably the mother and the grandmom to do?
No, I think my son and daughter-in-law are very, very hands-on parents, and my wife helps quite a lot. So I can't claim to be, but I think the fact that we're there was very important. So we're very happy to have, decided to go there and be with them.
We wish you all the best with the grandson, and we hope great things happen to him and to the family. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.